I am one of you. As with all masters of karate and evil, I am dedicated to destroying friendships with my evil karate. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go check on the prisoners. Hey guys, don't worry, it's me, the master of kung fu and friendship. I'm here to get you out so we can talk about this week's topic, the Shapeshifter Archetype. Boy, this plan was involved. I'm author DC Ferguson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, I want to give you all a quick reminder. Subscribers to my newsletter are getting a copy of Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, for free. This short story is a prequel to the Dragon's Dream saga and a great chance to get started with the series. I linked the newsletter sign up in the comments. Make sure to sign up and get your free copy. We begin this week by asking the same question we've been asking every week in our character archetype series, and that is, who the hell is this guy? And I'm so glad you asked. The Shapeshifter is the most fluid and mysterious of all archetypes, because just when we think we know who they are, they show us we didn't know them at all. Some of these swerves are entirely predictable, like the seemingly random seductress in a James Bond-style flick that's being played by a major actress, or others that come out of nowhere, like Wayne's love interest in Wayne's World. Schwing. The point is, these squirrely folk are often entering our hero's journey at the most opportune times, a sure sign that they've been watching from afar, or are working for someone who was. They show up, do their thing, and somewhere along the path, they change before our eyes. Their transformation is unlike the hero, though. It's not that they've grown and learned and broke the mold of who they were, no. When the reveal comes, we find out that we're only now seeing their true colors, and we've been wrong about them all along. We see this with Juno Skinner in the Arnold Schwarzenegger flick True Lies. This helpful contact and art dealer turns out to be a capitalist pig profiting from the terrorists, which is, again, being played by Tia Carrera. Girl really likes being a shapeshifter, dang. Anyway, there's so much more to it, though, and that's both symbolically and even physically, and we're going to get into all that. But first, as always, we must turn on the Quantum Leap Accelerator and travel back to a time of our ancestors and see why they set this archetype in stone. Our man Carl Jung has this interesting theory he toys about with called the anima and the animus. Undoubtedly, you may have heard these terms before if you're familiar with fantasy. As it relates to early psychology, however, the anima is the feminine portion of the male personality, while the animus is the masculine portion of the female mind. Jung believed that suppression of this portion of our personalities, either by way of society or by repression, leads to instability and breakdown. The shapeshifter is representative of this, quite literally, the spirit of unrepressed anima or animus. Now, our ancient bros are storytellers, so a good betrayal or a flipped ally is great drama. If you pair the dramatic content with the personification, you get an archetype that isn't like any other. Sure, they're self-aware of who they are, like the trickster, will often be a love interest, like the ally, and may have helpful information like a mentor, but their allegiance isn't necessarily with the hero at all. Quite the opposite, as with many stories, the shapeshifter is a spy or a betrayer and becomes a character we love to hate. We're going to get into morality later, but for now let's just say that justice catches up with them eventually. We see animus play in ancient tales like that of Delilah, a beautiful woman that crosses paths with Samson in the Old Testament of the Bible. Luring in the mighty warrior, she plies him with her wiles, seducing him with her femininity. But once he reveals the secret of his power comes from his long hair, she waits until he's asleep and cuts it. She brings in Philistine soldiers, the very enemy Samson was fighting. Weakened and without his supernatural strength, he's beaten and blinded by the soldiers. As it turns out, Delilah is what is commonly referred to as a femme fatale, a classic trope almost exclusively belonging to the shapeshifter. Delilah is a stateswoman first, loyal to her people like a soldier. Associated as a quote-unquote masculine trait, she uses her femininity to lure Samson in and drops his defenses, and he falls into her trap. She was more than meets the eye, and Samson was a fool to only look at the surface. As you can imagine, this is a cautionary tale of judging a book by its cover, only as it relates to people. Think about it. In an ancient world, with separate nation-states literally sitting next to each other and each the size of Rhode Island, or in the vast expanse of a wild frontier separated by hundreds of miles, Without the internet, without maps and defined borders, without worldly experience of recognizing an accent, how would you really know your enemy? If you bust down a door like John McClane and this dude, William Clay, pretends he's ready to go poo in his pants at the sight of you, how would you realize that you're actually talking to Hans Gruber? You'd befriend him, get to know him, and mutually earn each other's trust. Even then, he could be a liar secretly working for the enemy. You see what we're getting at? What our ancestors wanted to warn us of? But oh, what's this? What happens if our bestest buddy is a spy, has wormed their way into our hearts, and we've done the same to them? What happens when the shapeshifter triple crosses their boss? Well, that's worth looking at. Vader, oh Vader, the stoic shadow, so dark he wears black armor. But wait, what's this? Take note, in Star Wars and Empire, Darth Vader is a hard-line shadow, no two ways about it. But in Empire, we're teased with the Emperor, an evil so great even Vader kneels to it. Then with Vader's great reveal at the end of Empire, we know he's not just some random evil incarnate, but something much more. As such, not 1 minute of Return of the Jedi has ever been spent trying to develop Vader as a shadow. Instead, that role is filled by the Emperor and played up heavily. Vader switches to full-on shapeshifter for the entirety of the film. The only question is, can Luke make him flip? Now, we all know the answer to that, but watching the drama unfold, the way Vader takes the role instead of next week's archetype, the Guardian, is he truly happy with his choice? Is Evil's lieutenant the best he can hope for in light of finding his long-lost son? We're rooting for Luke, but by proxy, we're actually rooting for Vader to still have good in him. That weird thing we're doing with audiences, making them root for the bad guy in hopes that they're good, that's classic shapeshifter stuff. We can't really do this with any other archetype, toying with our audience's heads and building drama like that. We don't have to wait for the climax either. In the absolutely marvelous fantasy film Willow, for example, the queen's daughter Sorsha wears the colors of a soldier. When she finds our hero and the prophesied baby that the queen wants so bad, Sorsha is ready to do the queen's will. Yet, once she's bested in combat by Mad Mardigan, and again we're seeing a physical duel that begins a new relationship, she sets down a path that makes her realize her mother is evil and deserves justice for her treachery. She falls in love with Mad Mardigan and joins with Willow to protect the baby. When we're telling this version of the shapeshifter's tale, there is a certain yellow brick road of tropes we go down. The shapeshifter often wasn't evil at heart, simply it's how they were raised. In Anakin's case, he was seduced by the power of the dark side for altruistic reasons. But once hate consumed him, the reason didn't really matter anymore. As an aside, this was an extremely convoluted plot point of Revenge of the Sith, and proof positive that the prequel trilogy was about as poorly written as the new sequel trilogy was, but I digress. In the shapeshifter's turn to the light, there is often this sense of owing the hero, or their cause, as an atonement for the evils they've committed. This morality pops up on both sides of the coin. In the case of Sorsha, she had to support Willow's quest and put her sword and life on the line to battle her own mother. In the case of Vader, he turned against the Emperor and cast him down, but he had to die. Death was the only atonement after all the evils he had done. As such, to die saving the hero, he is rewarded spiritually in death, becoming a blue force ghost with our blessing. Since we're on the topic of morality, let's look at the flip side. The femme fatale, such as Elsa in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, is an ideal example of everything we've discussed. She's beautiful, knowledgeable, and willing to help Indy and his dad find the Holy Grail, but she is a nationalist through and through. Her loyalty to the German Nazi regime and their hunt for occult objects. When she appears, it is at the opportune moment to endear herself to Indy, and when she betrays him, the only price she can pay is in blood. This is the classic triumph of light over shadow. Those shapeshifters that have been seduced by the dark power of the shadow can only go one of two ways. They die as a guardian, or live long enough to see themselves become the shadow. But DC, what the heck are you talking about? Well, guy who talks to your monitor, there are a ton of examples of this, but me being the shameless person that I am, will use me. In a long-form series, such as the Dragon's Dream saga, if the shapeshifter enacts their betrayal and gets away with it, they become a problem unto themselves. More than a subcharacter or a side plot, the shapeshifter moves to center stage as a guardian that must now be dealt with before we can continue onward to the shadow. From the outset of the Pendragon Codex, we realize that this newly forming hero team that Cora Blake is putting together has a cancer. Someone on the team is a mole. This becomes a recurring theme throughout books 4 and 5. The problem is now so out of hand that Cora must face this shapeshifter turned guardian, and that is literally the plot of Book 6, Fated Alliance, which I'm writing as we speak. Look for that in the spring. We're going to do a whole thing with the cover reveal on the channel. It's going to be awesome. The point is, the evil shapeshifter must get their just desserts. If they betray our hero and get away with it, they become a guardian we have to address. When the light shapeshifter comes along, they must atone for their past in order to join our hero's great cause. Sometimes that will come at the cost of their own life. Now, I know you're wondering, what about a literal shapeshifter? Yes, I'm getting to that. So, when is a shapeshifter not a shapeshifter? Quite simply, when they're not the hero, or the shadow. Let's explore that. The Hulk, when starring in his own movie, is a monster tearing up the city in a rampage every time he gets mad. Likewise, Mr. Hyde is a monstrous brute whenever he breaks free of Dr. Jekyll. Now, these stories are often about the triumph or tragedy of a man overcoming the shadow within. So, let's say with Hulk, he gets to a point of spiritual creaminess where he understands how to line up the beast's motivations with his own and tackle a new, greater shadow that's arisen. So man and beast become one, and together they triumph over the shadow. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a tragedy, Jekyll never succeeds at aligning Hyde with him, and so with man and beast out of sync, he is ruined. His only atonement is to confess his deeds to ensure that Mr. Hyde, and therefore himself, remain locked up in a jail cell for all of time. Now, it's funny when we use these two examples because they've both been in standalone stories and films, but they've also been shapeshifters when they're introduced as part of a team. So let's look at the one we certainly know, and that's the Hulk's role in the first Avengers movie. The Shadow's entire plot hinges on the threat that there is a mild-mannered scientist that is basically a ticking time bomb to turn on, that our heroes will have to deal with his rage-induced flurry. So even Bruce Banner is an ally to the Avengers, though Hulk is not. As such, he exactly, to a T, fulfills the shapeshifter arc as we discussed, where his atonement, when he sees the light, requires him to again sync up man and beast and have the big green guy use his powers as an Avenger. The other example brings us to this week's deep cut, the abysmal, laughable 2003 film The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, based on the much, much better comic book series of the same name. But as a young master of Kung Fu and friendship, I so desperately nerded out to the thought of classic fantasy novel protagonists teaming up in a single superhero movie that I paid my money and saw this thing. And to think it's one of the last films we got to see the great Sean Connery before he retired. Crushing. Anyway, one of the characters recruited for this team is none other than Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A beast in Mr. Hyde's form, he is full of rage, animalistic, and not that much unlike the Hulk, but still very much cognizant of himself and his desires. As the resident muscle for the team, the climax see the chickens come home to roost when Jekyll's own formula is used against him with a cartoonishly large CGI version of himself that he must contend with. His atonement is to be the hero and save the team from the monster of his own making. That right there is the crux of the Shapeshifter archetype. We've discussed how often the other archetypes can dual class and be, say, a herald and an ally. And we can do that with the Shapeshifter too. Though nothing immediately springs to mind, we could, say, have a Shapeshifter mentor, one that is raising up the hero to fulfill a prophecy that serves the shadow. There's some meat on the bone to that kind of story, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, the Shapeshifter doesn't really play too well with the other archetypes. It can't ever be the hero or the shadow, we now know that. And why? More importantly, once the shapeshifter reveals their true nature, they stop being a shapeshifter and either switch over to an ally, or they turn evil and become a guardian. Again, in a long-form series, you have more opportunity to play with this a bit more and provide a wider arc for their transformation and reveal, but it's still mostly going to end the same. Whether they are an embodiment of the animus or the embodiment of an animal, it doesn't matter if they're a werewolf, vampire, changeling, or something in between. Where their heart lies is where they will eventually fall on the archetype spectrum going into the third act. I know it's time. You know it's time. So just go ahead and ask. But DC, I want my shapeshifter to be a flower. Can I do that? Once again, guy who talks to your monitor. The answer is certainly yes, though I'd say it's much harder. The inanimate object for this archetype I'd eyeball at being pretty narrow, only because this archetype is so interpersonal. However, there are a couple of obvious exceptions that come to mind, so let me rattle off some ideas for you here. For one, I could see a kind of MacGuffin-esque item that is not what everyone thought it was. Let's say, for example, a prophesized rare flower bud that must be possessed, but when our hero gets it, the pollen strips them of their magic powers or something to that effect. It's not quite a shapeshifter, but it's close. The more prominent example that I can think of is ready-made for us, and that's artificial intelligence that has ulterior motives. Whether we're talking about something coldly logical, like Skynet or the machines in the Matrix deciding that humans are the problem and obliterating us, or the evil programming embedded in RoboCop to prevent him from carrying out justice if his creators are involved. Anytime we're using AI to hinder or otherwise steer our heroes off course, we're employing an object shapeshifter of some degree. Now, the field for this is pretty narrow, as I said, because the shapeshifter thrives on interpersonal actions. The hero must believe them to either be on the side of light or darkness and be wrong. That's a huge part of the shapeshifter. Their allegiances switch in the course of storytelling. So, whether we're talking about Dr. Smith in Lost in Space, or the literal shapeshifter of Beast in Beauty and the Beast, there is strife with the protagonist at some point, and then a change comes. This change is driven by the shapeshifter's own motivations, one of the few archetypes that has their own agency built right into them. An ally can just be the hero's, ride or die, and do anything for them. They don't need more motivation than that. A shapeshifter chooses to join or betray our hero out of their own motivations, or in the case of AI, with their own programming. It's an important distinction, but one that we don't want to miss when we're creating and employing this archetype. They naturally feel more fleshed out and three-dimensional than the other archetypes out of the box. The shapeshifter is a deep undertaking in your writing. Often there'll be a major character throughout most of the story due to the time spent building them up, only to have them change sides. That said, investing the time in developing this archetype can also pay off in a big way, so it's worth considering this archetype both in and out of Hero's Journey Tales. We're still working with the Boston-based Needs organization to get this beautiful lady a service dog. Her name is Liana. She's 11 and she's on the spectrum. This wonderful person is my little girl, and if you'd like to help out, there is a link in the comments below. To give a quick shout out, I did notice a few additional donations after last week's video that specifically mentioned the channel, and I cannot tell you how humble and grateful I am for every donation. Thanks so much, guys. Also, don't forget to sign up in my newsletter in the comments down below. You're going to get Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. You'll get cool news about what I'm working on books and here on the channel, and it comes loaded with cool offers and promotions for fantasy and sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.